So if you search up a calorie tracker on the App Store, the first thing that's probably going to come up is MyFitnessPal. And how could it not? It has over 1.8 million views and it's one of the biggest apps there ever is for calorie tracking. But I think there's an app that does everything what MyFitnessPal does, but better. And I think that is Macrofactor. And Macrofactor is an up and coming app that has been out for a few years now, but I personally think this is one of the best apps there is out there. I've lost 60 pounds and I've kept it off. And because of Macrofactor, I was able to lose 10 more pounds just in a matter of 2 months. And it was the easiest thing that ever happened to me. So in this video, I want to go into everything regarding Macrofactor to see if it's really the app for you instead of MyFitnessPal. So let's get right into this. So to start off, let's talk in terms of price, because obviously with an app like MyFitnessPal, they do have a free version, but honestly, it doesn't really do anything for you. So that's why I mainly start focusing on the paid versions at first. So if you want something very basic, then MyFitnessPal can be your decent go-to tool in terms of basic protein, fats, and carbs. But then if you want something more advanced that will give you more of the stuff, then you gotta pay for the premium. So I'm solely just gonna focus on the premium for now. And so in terms of price, for MyFitnessPal, at the time of this recording, it is $79.99 for a year, and then it's $19.99 a month. So those are the only two options that you really have for MyFitnessPal. But for Macrofactor, it's actually cheaper. And this is the one thing that really got me into first taking a look at this, just because it was cheaper. Because if it's not cheaper than MyFitnessPal, then why am I gonna have this? So when I first saw this, it was $71.99 for the yearly membership. And then for the month, it was actually $11.99, so $8 cheaper. And then they also had a third option, which caught my interest at first, and that was the semi-annual one. So for 6 months, you can get it for about $47.99, which I thought was a pretty decent deal for me. Not just, I wanted to do more than a month, but I did not want to do the whole year. So that's what really got me into using Macrofactor first. So price goes to Macrofactor. One thing I would mention though is for Macrofactor is, if you're not using an affiliate link, they're only going to give you about a week to use it for a free trial. But if you use something like for Jeff Nippard or from any other influencer that uses Macrofactor, you can get a 2-week free trial. But for MyFitnessPal, they do provide a month for free. So that is something else to keep in mind as well. So obviously when you're going to be using these apps, the main thing you're going to do is, well, track food. And this is something both of them do fairly well at, but I think Macrofactor does a little bit better in this category. So on MyFitnessPal, you are able to track tons and tons of different foods and a lot of brands that it could be very helpful if you do select a wide variety of foods. But honestly, like, you don't really need that. It matters more down to quality, which I mostly focus on with Macrofactor because it consistently gives me results based off the foods that I'm eating every single day. So I always find that a win for Macrofactor compared to when I was using MyFitnessPal. And then on top of that, the other factor is terms of speed. So when I'm searching up stuff on MyFitnessPal, I've noticed that when I'm just using the app, regardless of what type of phone I've been using throughout the years, it's just been kind of slow in what I've been using. And I'm not using like cheap internet or like a bad phone and having all the apps open and stuff. So I'm mainly using a fairly basic feature of just searching food, but it seems a little bit slow. So when I look for something like on Macrofactor, it's actually way easier and it's beyond fast. It's lightning fast. And even if it can't search up the specific stuff that you want right at that moment, it can actually still show you all the foods that you've recently put in, at least when I'm searching it. So it makes it very simple just to put in the food, and then after that, you set it and forget it. And when it also comes to actually finding certain foods, for example, a lot of times you are probably going to use a barcode if you're searching up any food. A lot of times you might not actually have a barcode. So something that's very helpful with Macrofactor is that they're also able to read labels. So what you could do is that if you go to a place like Whole Foods where they have a lot of custom foods in the buffet, or even like if you go to Albertsons or Vaughn's and they have specific things with labels that you can't really get from the barcode, what you could do with Macrofactor is just hover your camera over the specific item and then it will be able to track all the food within that thing. And honestly, like this is a very helpful thing if you're having bigger calorie items. Like let's say if you're having something like chicken or starchy vegetables such as like sweet potatoes or potatoes, like potato wedges, whatever you're putting in. This is very helpful to have because those calories add up. But if you're doing something like, let's say, I don't know, fruit and it has a custom label, that might not be something that you actually care about, especially if it's like mixed fruit. But Macrofactor focuses on speed, so it just makes it very convenient, and they actually stick to their word when it comes to finding those specific foods. But what if you don't even have a label to work with? What if it's just the food? Sadly, Macrofactor can't scan an item just from scratch, but MyFitnessPal actually can. You can simply, let's say, hover over an apple and it will be able to say, okay, this is how many calories is in this apple. And while that is helpful, most of the time you could just search it up. Like you could just search up an apple and the weight. And that's honestly what matters more, because if you do rely on actually scanning your meals in that case, yes, it is faster, but remember, this is off generalization. So it could be off by 100, 200 calories. And truth be told, you can put in the ingredients and via the meal, it'll show up the ingredients after and you can edit it a little bit. But honestly, that is a lot of room for error that I don't really think is perfect to have. Another thing that Macrofactor does very well compared to MyFitnessPal is that you can search up any food that you want and then you put it in, and then it will actually keep it at the top of the bar so you know exactly what the macros are. And this is very helpful compared to just simply putting it in and then you got to look back and put it in and look back. You get the idea. So having this is beyond easy to just know your meal plans and what you want to put, because truth be told, both of them can input stuff in the future and you could put specific times of when you put them. So that's not really a problem. But in terms of the speed and understanding how much you're actually eating all at once within a certain meal, just makes it way more convenient and a no-brainer for me to use something like Macrofactor. Speaking of dashboards, comparing MyFitnessPal to Macrofactor, MyFitnessPal actually does have a little bit more in terms of what you can actually put on the dashboard. For something like Macrofactor, it is a little bit fixed in what it's going to give you. So for example, it will just give you like energy expenditure and your weight trend. But for something like MyFitnessPal, it will give you a lot of different specific goals you want to hit. So if you really want to focus on your saturated fat, you could simply just pull that up and then bam, it's right there. For Macrofactor, you kind of got to search through a little bit, but I wouldn't say that's too big of a deal in terms of the general scheme of things. But it is something that's also important to know. You can also edit how most of these things actually look on Macrofactor. So if you want to focus on, let's say, like the carbs that you eat within a food or your protein, or heck, even all of it, all you can do is just go to the settings and then edit all that out. For something like MyFitnessPal, they don't really have this to even begin with because you have to manually keep putting each food. Yes, there is a quick add, but Macrofactor also has this as well. So it just is a lot more customizable compared to MyFitnessPal. And that's why I just like using this, because it's just a little bit fun actually, just me choosing the way how I want to focus on the food that I actually eat. And when you put in food for MyFitnessPal generally has breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then like snacks and exercise, which you could just put in. But honestly, you don't really need that, because what matters more is the time itself. So it doesn't matter if you had breakfast for whatever food that you put. It's more like, did you eat it at 4 a.m.? Did you eat it at 5, 6, 7, 8 a.m.? It does show that within the time lapses, but because I'm a little bit picky, I generally don't really want to have that within the meals. Macrofactor, on the other hand, takes a different approach. And what they do is that instead of saying breakfast, lunch, dinner, or your snacks, what they'll just do is that they'll just have a simple time frame of the foods that you can actually put in. So let's say if I had bacon and eggs, what I could just do is that I'll just pull it up, put the search, and then I put the time, and then bam, it's right there. And then all I need to do is that I could just scroll through the times, and then that's how I could just put in the food. So let's say later in the day, I forgot to put a different snack. I could just click on that and say, hey, at 4 a.m. around this time, I put this in. And MyFitnessPal does this, but except I feel like it's a little bit more manual in the parts that it actually takes, or at least the time that it takes to get this done. So that's just a little thing I generally like more about Macrofactor. Speaking of macros, gosh, I'm just doing really well with these macro puns. But on Macrofactor, on each part, you can actually look at the top and see how much protein, fats, and carbs that you have for each one. So I can simply just take a quick look and say, okay, this is how much I had in the day, and then I can just go about it. So that is pretty helpful if you really want to see that. It's not unnecessary, but it's always handy. It's one of those things that if you don't notice it until it's not there, because when I started using MyFitnessPal, I didn't think about this, but now that I've been using Macrofactor, I just like seeing this every day when I put in my food. And on top of that, they make it really easy to just bulk edit everything. So let's say I got the whole hour wrong, or if I'm cooking and then I move it into a different hour, I could just simply click on one and then I could just click on a multiple of them, and then I could just move it to the next hour, or I can move it between hours. So that is a very handy part just to have as well on Macrofactor. If you also don't want to look at all the other hours because it is on a time base, you can click on the top right and then it will only put in the hours that you actually put in food. So pretty handy if you ask me, but not really necessary, you could say. And then also you can edit the duration of the hours of when you put in food. So generally they start it at 7 a.m. of the first tick of time that you can actually put in that amount of food or wherever you put, but you can set it as early as, I would say, I think like 12 a.m. if I'm not mistaken, or you could do it as early as like 3 or 4 or whatever time you wake up to, begin your day of having food, and then also the end of the day. And I would not say this is intermittent fasting, this is just solely food logging. But with something like MyFitnessPal, they actually do have intermittent fasting, which is something Macrofactor does not have. But truth be told, I don't really think intermittent fasting matters too heavily compared to the grand scheme of things, such as, are you actually eating enough to gain weight or less enough to lose weight? You know what I mean? Like that, it's just an extra feature that's cool, but I don't think that's really necessary to have, because at least for me, I don't really focus too much on that. But if you want to have it all within one app and not have another app like Zero, which is a fasting app, then it does make a lot of sense to just put it all in one. But if you look later in Macrofactor's roadmap in the future, they do plan on having this sometime in the future. Another thing in terms of integration is actually water, surprisingly. For Macrofactor, they don't really have a section where they have water, but for MyFitnessPal, they do. So for very basic things like that, that's where MyFitnessPal does take the lead, because they have been around for a long time. But I wouldn't be surprised if Macrofactor catches up with these types of features that I just mentioned. Both apps do have a quick add feature where you could simply just do a really quick moment of putting in your macros, your fats, and your protein, and also obviously the calories. But the main difference I feel like between the two would be in terms of nutrition. So let's say, for example, if I'm making foods or recipes on either of the apps, by the way, they can do both of these very easily, you could say. If I'm deciding to make, let's say, like a certain recipe or have a custom food, I can simply just put the information in, and then Macrofactor will give me everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. It will give me very specific things, such as what is the type of protein within the foods that I'm eating, such as like my essential amino acids. And it will give me varying degrees of, hey, this is how much you're actually having. For something like MyFitnessPal, they're not really focusing on these things because they're mainly catering to the general user. And truth be told, you can be a bodybuilder or an athlete and use MyFitnessPal by all means. But using something like Macrofactor, it just gives you way more data in terms of what you can actually play with and have knowledge in. The other thing to also mention for this so-called Nutrition Explorer, at least that's how they say it for all the in details of nutrition, you can also look at each part very easily. They have a little block and it'll say, hey, this is how much of calories you've had through the month or the week or the year, or however the timeline, whatever the options that they have at the time of the recording. And you'll be able to see through all these types of metrics. So you want to see stuff such as like your protein or like the specific essential amino acid like leucine. You can see that in your meals. Obviously, it is catered to what you're putting in the actual food log because everything caters to that. But so far, it's been pretty accurate in what I've actually been putting. But for MyFitnessPal, they also do it similar, but just in a more simplified fashion. So they're not going to give you specific things such as like the essential amino acids of certain foods or very specific minerals aside from what you see on your typical label, but it will show handy stuff such as like, hey, this is how much you've had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as well as your snacks. So that's where that part, as I mentioned earlier, really is a benefit, but I think Macrofactor does it better in terms of time. And that's also another part that the Nutrition Explorer does very well, is it's able to see, hey, here's a specific time on average that you've been having your protein. And it will also obviously give you the most foods that you have in terms of protein. MyFitnessPal does this as well, and I think they do it a little bit better in terms of insights, because they'll also tell you, hey, this is your highest calorie foods. But truth be told, that's just like an awareness thing than rather just of deep insights of all the types of foods that you're eating. Also on the Nutrition Explorer for Macrofactor is not only if you have these blocks throughout the time period, it's also going to give you a little bit of insight. It'll have a little note under all your data and it'll say why it's actually important. So if I search up something like vitamin B12, it's going to say why that vitamin's important and why I should actually have it and not die from brain dysfunction or something like that. Or just little handy things of long-term habits that you have in terms of what foods you eat. And then on top of that, it'll give you a certain range throughout the day. It'll say your optimal range based off the data you give it, but they also do have specific goals if you want that as well. MyFitnessPal only has the goals and not really recommendations, you could say, but it's basically just a flat standard that MyFitnessPal has from what I've had the last time I used it. And before we go more into the non-food categories of Macrofactor and MyFitnessPal, there's one thing I do want to mention about what Macrofactor is doing really good at right now, and that is their AI tool. And for the AI tool, what you could do is it's kind of like a scan a meal part for MyFitnessPal, but except what you could do instead is that you could actually just type out all the ingredients that you had super quickly, and then you could just end up putting that into your food logger. And question is, why is this actually better than the scan a meal? You know, wouldn't the scan a meal be better because you visually have that? Well, personally, I don't think so, because with the scan a meal, what you need to do is that one, you actually need to have an image of all your food that's there. So let's say if you have something that's a lot of food, such as like a buffet, and you're trying to just scan it on your phone and try to be accurate on that, I don't really think MyFitnessPal will do very well with that compared to what you could do with Macrofactor. But then on top of that with Macrofactor, you can also put in specific measurements beforehand rather than after. So you're not guessing in this case. So if you say, hey, I have 2 ounces of chicken with a handful of walnuts, you can simply just put that in, and then it will be able to accurately give you that most of the time. And it's not varying in proportion, because handful always means handful with Macrofactor. But if you say, okay, I have a bowl of fruit with, let's say, from MyFitnessPal, and you're trying to scan it with a meal, it's going to be way harder to know that time after time after time. And this is another thing I also want to mention for Macrofactor, is that it is pretty dang smart compared to MyFitnessPal. And here's what I mean. When you're doing something like wanting to gain weight, lose weight, or even maintain your weight, Macrofactor is way more practical in how it actually structures your eating plans. So let's say if you want to lose weight. So for example, for me, when I first signed up for Macrofactor, I wanted to lose about 20 pounds, and I want to lose it about a pound a month. What I could do is that before I even do anything, I put in all my prerequisites. So let's say I do my weight, my age, my height, my sex, all the general stuff every food app generally gets from you. But the main difference is that it doesn't just consider that, it also considers in more specific things within your goals. So let's say, like, how active are you, and not just in terms of just activity, but also like how advanced are you in your strength training? How advanced are you in your cardio? And those things you might think, okay, well, yeah, I could just put this in MyFitnessPal as my exercise tracker. But I personally like this a lot more because it's generally, one, more accurate, and then two, it's more sustainable in the long term. Because on top of this, week after week, it will actually check in with you and see how you're doing on this. And by the way, I'm referring to the coach program for this. There are other apps such as Collaborative and then Manual, which Manual is more like MyFitnessPal in that case, but we're talking about the sake of Coached for now. In terms of Coached, you can set up those different things and as well as your experience levels. And then you can also set up specific things that you want in terms of what you eat. So you can say, okay, well, I'm mainly keto. I want mainly a lot of high protein meals. And yes, you can do this on MyFitnessPal based off your macros and your percentage targets. But except I personally like this with Macrofactor because it's not just doing your macros, it's adjusting it over time. So at the end of the week, when you do your weekly check-in, what it will do is that it'll say, okay, let's say you weighed yourself 3 times this week and you lost 2 pounds faster than 1 pound. Like let's say your goal is losing 1 pound per week and you end up losing 2 pounds. So if that happens consistently, what Macrofactor will do is that it will adjust it to only go to 1 pound per week. So you would end up actually eating more calories. And for those people who are thinking, well, why do I need this? Because I want to lose weight. Well, genius, you're the one that put 1 pound per week, not 2 pounds per week. So that is not Macrofactor's fault. That is your fault. So get your numbers right. So you could shift the calories week by week or day by day. That's really up to you. And personally, it's very flexible in how you can approach your diet. And that's why I love Macrofactor so much compared to MyFitnessPal, because it generally with MyFitnessPal, it feels way more rigid. With Macrofactor, it is very dynamic and it's very flexible to your needs, and generally with all types of food actually. So that's personally why I enjoy using Macrofactor more in this scenario. And once you're done with a goal, what you could do is that you can actually make a new goal, which is pretty simple, but then you can also edit your programming however you want. So whether it's a current goal or a new goal, you can totally change up the way how you want to approach your new way for your diet, which I personally just love having. Very simple, very easy, flexible, dynamic, all of the above. So moving on to the physical aspects of these apps, Macrofactor, what it does really well is that you can actually put in body metrics. So when it comes to body metrics, you can actually put pictures of yourself on the front side, the side, and then the rear. And then after that, you can then use the algorithm that Macrofactor has after searching of many bodies, you could say, and then it will give you a general fat percentage of what you are currently. So for example, you might have thought that you're actually like 12% or 10%, but you're actually 15, or vice versa. But I wouldn't say this is the holy grail of looking at your body type, but except it's generally just a good note to have. You can kind of think of it like a sticky note than an actual like thermometer where it's checking the exact way how your body looks. But hey, that's just a useful thing to have. And you can actually put in different metrics for specific body parts. So for example, if you want to measure your waist or your hips, you can just get a measuring tape, put that around you, and then have a weekly measurement over time to see, hey, this is how big my waist is getting if I'm trying to build muscle, or let's say if I'm losing weight, hey, wow, I can actually fit in like smaller jeans and I wonder what I am. Oh, there it is. Like just stuff like that. And it just feels a lot more personable as you're going out through either losing weight or gaining weight. For MyFitnessPal, however, the only thing that you really have is just weight. And that's not very helpful in just terms of like, okay, well, you are losing weight, but are you losing on your waistline? Are you losing it in your hips? What about like your chest? Where is it actually coming from? So you could also say this pinpoints more in specific body parts than just your overall weight. So that's just a helpful thing to know. But the main difference between these two, I would say, would be integrations. And for something like MyFitnessPal, you can have tons of different integrations from basically any app that is popular. You can get it from Strava, you can get it from Garmin, you can get it from your Apple Health app. It all just connects seamlessly. And that is something that is very helpful in terms of the metrics that it can extract. But does that mean that it's good to have? And personally, I don't really think it's good to have in terms of just exercise alone. Because if you're trying to get stuff in terms of exercise, and I'm not referring to exercise from the apps, but exercise in general, a lot of the times it can create this toxic cycle between you desiring to eat more calories solely because you burn some calories. That's honestly it. But truth be told, you don't even need that in the first place. Yes, of course, when you work out, you might need to eat a little bit more. Like that's a brain dead thing. Obviously, everyone knows that, or at least a majority of people do. But a lot of the times for your macros, you don't need to have more. It should just already be as is. So for Macrofactor, it already factors all these things, and hence the lifting and the cardio, as I mentioned earlier, and it will already give you an optimal protein target based off that. So you don't need to put in exercises on Macrofactor. And on top of that, controversial, but they don't let you put most of that stuff in. And that's one of the main reasons why. The second reason why is that it's also wildly inaccurate, and also really depends on what you're doing. So let's say for you, if you're 5'8" and 180 pounds, which is around my target at the time of this recording, you could be totally different after when you work out. So let's say I work out for 30 minutes to an hour, and then I go on for the rest of my day. Either one might be more active, or two might be less active. So a lot of times in terms of activity, it's very wide depending on the person, because some people could be totally energized after they work out, and other people could be totally sluggish and inactive altogether, especially when it comes to stuff like cardio. If you're a runner, it really depends. And the last thing I want to mention is that it's wildly inaccurate in terms of calories that you're burning. It could be anywhere from 5 to 35% off in terms of your Apple Watch or Fitbit or your Garmin. So let's say if you're running and then you're burning 1,000 calories, if it's up to 35% off, you burn about 350 calories less than what you thought. So if you're thinking about that in the long term, and you have this vicious cycle of, okay, I can eat more and I want to, because I used to have this feeling, I'm sure dozens of other people have, you might want to be promoted to eat more, but you actually are inaccurate in your numbers. So you don't really want to have that exercise metric at all. Also factoring in the things such as like you're already getting enough protein from your macros, and also same thing with your fats and carbs. So it's not really necessary to have. And that's the one thing I like about Macrofactor, is because when I'm putting in my calories, I don't have to think about the exercise. It already factors all that in. So I don't really have to think too much of that. So that's what just makes it very easy. However, there is one big flaw in terms of Macrofactor that in this case, MyFitnessPal could take a little win on this, and that is the adjusting of the calories itself. So let's say if I am doing suddenly a marathon, which I'm a beginner and I don't really do a lot of cardio, and all of a sudden I'm going from like 0 to 10, 20, 30, 40 miles, Macrofactor is going to have a huge delay. And when I mean huge, I mean like 2 weeks in terms of it catching up to the calories that you actually need to eat. So you don't want to be in, depending on your body type, like 2,300 calories, because in the cardio, you're going to be burning a lot more. So Macrofactor will do this over time gently, but you can also do this in the manual and the collaborative. So that's a way to kind of bypass it unless if you're using the coached. But that's just one thing to keep in mind as well. And the same thing is the opposite. Let's say you're actually injured, because I actually got injured a couple months ago. I had to lower my calories because I wasn't being as active, and Macrofactor did not really know this at the time. But then again, you could also make a little bit of edits on a program by editing the program, so that can buffer it out a little bit. But there is one thing I wish I did see from Macrofactor, and that is actually a step counter. Because yes, you can actually get a lot of steps on your MyFitnessPal, and they could get it from a variety of different sources. But for Macrofactor, it just doesn't have anything. So let's say in this case, I'm walking 20,000 steps a day, or you can also have walking and running, because running is like just very aggressive walking in this context. So what you can do is, like, let's say if I have 15,000 steps, Macrofactor can understand, okay, this is your average. Therefore, we know this is how many calories you're going to burn based off your weight, sex, height, whatever. But if you suddenly go from that to 2,000, that's where it can kind of buffer out a little bit more. But personally, I think it'd be better if this is optional, not like a mandatory thing to have. But that's just my opinion. So for these two apps, what I would say is like if you've, let's say, lost weight on MyFitnessPal and you've kept it off forever and you never, got the weight back, then good for you. I'm not saying MyFitnessPal is a terrible app. But if you are, let's say, new to losing weight, or you think that losing that weight that you never thought was possible, using Macrofactor, in my personal opinion, is just way better to have. And it's because of all the tools that I mentioned throughout this video. So having those things are just way more beneficial and way more practical compared to MyFitnessPal in the long term, I would say. And on top of that, they're getting a lot more updates even by the time that you see this video. So there's probably way more by the time that you download it, and it's still cheaper than MyFitnessPal. So who doesn't want that? So it's not actually the apps that you use, but rather how you use them. And what I mean by that is you can still have all your macros in place, you're doing amazing, but except if you're binge eating at the end of the day for whatever reason, then that is such a struggle and you're not going to actually lose any weight, especially if the goal is to lose weight. So in the upcoming future, I'm going to make a video about how I was able to lose 60 pounds in just a matter of a couple of months without giving up any of my favorite sweets and anything that I really wanted to eat actually. So if you guys want to see that video, make sure that you subscribe down below to stay tuned. As always, I will see you guys in the future. All right, take care.